In a moment, we'll talk to Yahya Al Aridi, the spokesman for the Syrian Negotiations Commission, which represents the opposition to Bashar al-Assad. We're also joined by Sergey Markov, director of the Institute for Political Studies in Russia. But first of all, let's get some context to all of this. TRT World's Andrew Hopkins is covering the talks in Sochi. Andrew, tell us who is there, but also, just as importantly, who isn't there?
Yeah, it's a real mixed bag, Adnan, with quite a few gaping holes in the attendees as well. We understand there were about 1,700 invitations sent out to delegates. We've no idea of exactly how many turned up. We have heard figures of about 1,000 bandied around, but there's been no official confirmation, and that does include delegates who are politicians or basically supporters of the Syrian regime, as well as parts of the opposition. Now, as far as the countries who are leading the Astana and Sochi process are concerned, Russia, Turkey and Iran, it's mainly lower-level ministers and high-level diplomats, although we have had an opening speech from the Russian Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov, who was actually heckled by protesters when that was taking place. However, absent are France and the UK. They were both invited as permanent members of the UN Security Council. They say they didn't want to come because these negotiations should be taking place through the UN at Geneva, and that's the case for the High Negotiations Committee as well. This is the main internationally recognised opposition negotiating body who are involved in the talks at Geneva. They said they didn't want to come for exactly the same reason, and that's left just a few other opposition bodies who are maybe smaller, don't have as much of a high profile as the HNC, and therefore maybe not as much clout in these talks.
Andrew Hopkins in Sochi, thank you very much indeed, Andrew. OK, let's speak to Sergey Markov and Yahya Al Aridi. Thank you for your time, gentlemen. Sergey Markov, how can these peace talks be taking place in Sochi while the regime in Syria is carrying out airstrikes and killing people, and just the latest example involving Syrian regime planes, because as you well know, over the past few weeks, Russian planes have also been involved in airstrikes?
Where you took this propagandistic tone? Maybe it's your question too propagandistic. Let's talk more politically neutrally, and I will try to explain the political logic of what's happening. We have Geneva talks, which is supported by United Nations as major track of the peace negotiation for the Syria, for the transformation from the civil war to the peaceful life and political process and political discussion. It's Geneva, it's number one. But Geneva talks have been blocked by Saudi Arabia and United States. And because Saudi Arabia and United States still dream to support on puppets in Syria to fight against Bashar Assad. In such conditions, when Daesh have been crushed and Jabhat al-Nusra and other terrorist organizations also have been limited, now we have a good chance to move step by step to the peace negotiation. And Russia decided, okay, if they block Geneva talks, let's try another talk. First, they started in Astana about peaceful process. Now they decided maybe to involve not representative political forces, but representatives of the different regional, ethnical, and religious community of Syria, which is invited to this Syrian Congress. It means that if Geneva talks will go forward, main decision will be made on those Geneva chiefs. But if United States and Saudi Arabia will continue to block Geneva talks, a peaceful process in Sochi will be a priority.
OK. Yahya Al Aridi, what do you make of that? First of all, do you believe, like Sergey has said to me, that it's propaganda to suggest it's a little bit strange that peace talks are taking place while there are airstrikes going on inside Syria? And also, do you agree with Sergey Markov that the United States and Saudi Arabia are trying to derail the Geneva talks, and that therefore, as Sergey says, Russia is taking the lead and holding talks with initiatives in other parts of the world, namely Astana and Sochi?
When something doesn't go along with your logic and you automatically resort to labeling it as propaganda, well, there is a real problem in logic itself here. Syria has been suffering for 7 continuous years of the regime's brutality because basically people rose against a brutal dictatorship and they were faced with bullets. And they got the support of the militias, Hezbollah militias. Then the Iranian Republican Guard came to the rescue, and those said it. Hezbollah said it, and Iran said it. Had it not been for us, the regime would have fallen. And all that just also continued not to succeed against the people. Then came the Russian interference in 2016, and Mr. Putin said in 3 months' time he would just finish this whole thing. Until now, still Russian airplanes are bombarding civilian areas and supporting the regime with its brutality against people. There are certain Security Council resolutions, starting with the Geneva Communique of 2012 and then 2254, which talks about a political transition, a transitional governing body. Russia tried all along to discredit the opposition, which represents the people, not by elections, but those people who just wanted to just voice the opposition and say, talk on the part of the masses, the people. Now, in 2254, there is something called ceasefire, and Russia just condensed that into Astana and turned that into de-escalation zones. And these de-escalation zones are breached on daily basis, not only by the regime, but by Iran and by Russia itself, which is the guarantor. Then selectively, it wanted to talk about a dialogue in Sochi, a Syrian national dialogue. How could you make a dialogue in 6 hours, which were interrupted frequently, those 6 hours, or by 1,200 people so far in Sochi? If one breathes normally or sneezes, the 6 hours would be finished. Now, the HNC or SNC, the Syrian Negotiating Committee, tried in a marathonic way in Vienna for 2 continuous days with the UN, with the Russians, and previously, 3 days ago, 3 days before that, it went to Moscow, and we sat there, we talked with Lavrov about possibilities of finding a peaceful solution for Syria. And we felt that we convinced the man for the first time, face to face, that we really wanted peace. And we would go anywhere in the world in order to find a solution for our people that have been suffering all this time. And the road to finding peace is not through Sochi this way, because that idea of dialogue was selectively picked up from 2254, and which is supposedly to be carried out by the TGB, Transitional Governing Body. Now, all this thing happening, and we felt that the road to finding peace to Syria is not through Sochi. And it is, we felt, really, and we can prove that, such a gathering, which is not opposition, which people who are completely supportive of this brutal regime. They would say, we sacrifice our souls for your sake, Assad. That's what they are saying in Sochi. Is this the way to find peace? Now, one final thing I want to say is that our feeling is that this conference is to legitimize the Assad regime. That's for one thing. Another thing is to say that the Russian military presence in Syria is also legitimate. Now, Russia says it is legitimate because it's invited by a legitimate government. You cannot be legitimate when you kill your people.
Okay, Sergey and Yahya, it seems that in your disagreements, in your opening statements, that you have raised a number of extremely important issues which we have to break down here a little bit. Let's start with going backwards. Astana. Sergey, Yahya has just said, and it's proven, it's there in black and white, that the de-escalation zones have not exactly been successful, with Russia and Iran being the guarantors. Clearly, Turkey is also involved, but no one's accusing Turkey of breaking the rules in the de-escalation zones. There is evidence. People have died. It's well documented. the Astana process in terms of the de-escalation zones, that has not been successful. Can you agree with that?
Not entirely. Of course, de-escalation zone are not entirely work correctly, but also they work in big part. You know, it's impossible during the civil war to jump from the civil war to the peace when everybody will respect the stopping of the struggle. No, it should be made step by step. It should be parallel, working more and more for the de-escalation zone to work more properly, and same time to work about political process. And, you know, I want to ask you, if you want now to move political process with temporary government without Bashar Assad, it's impossible. He is the winner. You have to respect this. And but the government to which we could go should be coalition government, which can include different political forces. And now in Sochi they discuss new Syrian constitution. I think Syria needs constitution not authoritarian, but more look like Lebanon, when all major religious ethnic groups will be represented in the government and the parliament, and will be sure about their right to be respected on the top Damascus level.
Okay, so Yahya, that's the Russian government position, is it not, that the future of Syria should include Bashar al-Assad? What is the HNC position here? Is it still that Bashar al-Assad has to go before any future is found?
Well, this is a pretext being used by Russia when we had the Riyadh communique, which talked about unconditional negotiations in Geneva. And we went there wholeheartedly to talk without preconditions, as Russia wanted. All along, Russia tried to discredit their position because it is fragmented and it is just making preconditions. We said we don't want preconditions, but please forgive us for having a goal that this person who was the cause for Syria suffering all this time cannot be there. I tell you that Russia itself cannot help, cannot keep, cannot protect, cannot continue supporting this brutal dictatorship for a long time. Russia is being hurt now. What does it mean to use the veto 11 times to protect the brutal regime? Used chemical weapons. And in Syria, there's no civil war as it is being propagandized by others. People rose against dictatorship, simply that. And the problem, when you gather this number of people in Sochi, you feel that the problem is among those people. The problem is not among those people. The problem is among those people and a brutal regime in the first place. Now, Geneva is the track for finding peace. It takes just one little thing, and Russia can do it. That's if it wants. They have to pressure this regime that they are responsible for keeping it there in order to get involved in the political process, in negotiations. So far, they haven't been doing it. We don't know whether it is their will that they do not want, or they cannot. It seems that at certain points they cannot, because Iran is there and it has its plan, its vicious and cunning plan, in order to control these countries. Iranian officials said it, that we have control over 4 Arab capitals. That's what they said. And they wanted Damascus to be part of it. And the Russians themselves have a problem with the Iranians and with that regime that is supported by other people. It is not the issue of Saudi Arabia and America, and when my friend Sergey said at the beginning. It's not that. It is now, have Saudis been killing Syrians? Have Americans been killing Syrians? Well, who is killing Syrians are the regime itself. Iran, the militias, and 83 militias from different parts of the world. They were brought into into Syria. And Russia itself, Putin said that we tried over 200 kinds of weapons in Syria.
Okay, Yahya, you're talking to us here in the TRT World studio. Why are you not in Sochi saying what you're saying here at that conference?
Well, the problem is not with those 1,200 or 1,700 people. our problem as opposition is not amongst ourselves. Our basic problem is with that regime being supported by Iran, by the different militias, and by Russia. We wanted Russia to have a real responsibility towards the people, not a gang that just gave it permission to have military bases there. We as people, 23 million people, are more important than 1,000 people who are just doing all these things. Why we are not there? One thing is that we believe that Sochi is not the road to finding peace for Syria. Another thing, we feel that Sochi is to legitimize this dictatorship and continue to be brutalizing people because it has been living on tension. A third thing is that it could be legitimizing what may be called by many people Russian occupation of Syria. And a third thing, there is no way to dialogue here. There is no way to talk to one another. How could you, for instance, have a national dialogue by 1,700 people? If this is a representation of different components of the Syrian society, you should have the 23 million people. Half of them were displaced by the regime, and half of them inside. You could have brought them all to Russia so that they can be represented. They cannot be represented, and they don't have any legitimacy at all. That's why we didn't go.
Sergey, if the discussion that's happening here right now is the discussion that, let's say, symbolizes a discussion between the one side that supports the regime of Bashar al-Assad and the other side, his opponents, this isn't going anywhere. Whether it's in Sochi, Vienna, Geneva, Astana, it doesn't matter. It appears as if it's going nowhere. How do you gain the trust of the opposition? Presumably, Bashar al-Assad's forces need that trust before any progress can be made.
I think that Bashar al-Assad also understands that he couldn't be just a winner as a Roman imperator who just will dictate to everybody. He understands very well that different political forces should be included in the new peaceful coalition government. And also, we, as Russia, invited different political forces to take part in this negotiation peace process. And you could see that those who protested against Sergey Lavrov, it looked like they are against Russia, they are against Bashar Assad. And it means that in Sochi we have brought representation of the different political forces. But if somebody like our friend Yahya wants to take part in the peaceful negotiation on the base that Bashar Assad should leave and Russia should withdraw from Russia, it's impossible because, you know, Russia is winner and Bashar Assad also winner. You cannot give up winners. But who really blocks those negotiations? Saudi Arabia and United States. If political forces will be independent on Saudi Arabia and United States and will go to the Syrian people and ask them, you want to continue civil war or you want to stop it and move to the peaceful transformation? They will say, oh, please, Mr. Yahya, go to the peace. We want coalition government. We want representation of the different religious ethnic groups. And we don't want Saudi Arabia. And as a result, it will be realistic negotiation. If political forces wanted to take part in negotiations on this base, then they will take part in those negotiations. If political forces don't want, communities from Syria will decide themselves, and those political forces will be marginalized.
Sergey Markov, Yahya Al Aridi, both of you, thank you for your time. Thank you for joining us on the Newsmakers.